spreche hier aus dem gewesenen Konzentrationslager Lublin, bekannt unter dem polnischen Namen Majdanek. Sie können sich keine
I'm speaking from the former concentration camp Lublin, known by its Polish name Majdanek. You can't imagine what it meant to be in the Lublin camp, to spend weeks, months, or even years there. Nor will any human tongue or writer ever be able to describe what came to pass on this relatively small patch of ground. You could say that every square inch of land is soaked with blood. Perhaps one day historians will be able to describe in rough terms what happened at Majdanek. But to make a film that shows everything witnessed here would be impossible.
Das zu schildern, was sich hier abgespielt hat. Aber einen Film zu drehen, der alles das bringt, was man hier gesehen hat.
In the March 1944 offensive, Soviet and Polish troops advanced to within 100 miles of Lublin. For the Polish soldiers, the liberation of their fatherland was expressed not only in their combat, but also as they kissed the ground. July 16, 1944, saw the beginning of the summer offensive on the Belarusian front, codename Bagration. Polish military units and partisans from the Armia Krajowa, land forces, supported the Russian army. Lublin was surrounded on the 22nd and 23rd of July. The German commanding officer, Lieutenant General Hilmar Moser of Lublin, capitulated on the 24th of July, 1944. The Polish flag was raised in Poland. In 1941 and 42, on the orders of SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, the Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka extermination camps were built in the Warthegau region and the eastern district of Poland. Auschwitz and Majdanek were both concentration camps as well as extermination camps. Majdanek was just 1.5 miles from Lublin. The old Polish town of Lublin goes back to the 13th century. The reign of terror of the Gestapo and the German Secret Service began on September 17, 1939. Of Lublin's 122,000 inhabitants, 30,000 were killed or deported. These films of Russian tanks and Polish troops entering Lublin were taken at the end of July 1944. The joy and enthusiasm, and the tears as well, were genuine. Tears of joy, tears of grief and despair. Captain Kamiński, who was in charge of the Polish military liberating Lublin, the first Polish town to be liberated, was overwhelmed by the welcome he received from the people of Lublin. Mothers and wives seek out and lament for their murdered sons and husbands. Just days before the liberation, the German authorities transferred hundreds of Polish prisoners from jail cells in Lublin to the Majdanek concentration camp. There they were murdered and their bodies burned the day before the liberation. On the grounds of the castle jail, the liberators found the corpses of 450 men and women. The Russian protocol of July 25, 1944, states, "The deaths of the prisoners were caused by gunshot wounds to the head. Burns on the entry wounds indicate that the shots were fired at point-blank range." The protocol carries the signatures of Soviet officers and representatives of the Polish population. After seeing the crimes, Captain Kamiński, one of the first Polish soldiers to liberate Lublin, wrote, "Like most soldiers, I could not forget these pictures as I took part in the occupation of Berlin." Soviet reconnaissance planes take the first aerial photographs of the Majdanek camp complex. Lublin is in the background. The camp was built to the southwest of Lublin on 625 acres of land formerly cultivated by Polish farmers. 5 sections, each with 24 barracks, a roll call area, and a double barbed wire fence electrified at high voltage. In 1943, SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler has the bodies of those already murdered in the Chelmno, Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka death camps exhumed and cremated. The gas chambers and crematoriums were blown up and dismantled. All documents are destroyed in order to erase the traces of this crime of the century. At Majdanek, it was too late to completely destroy the barracks, the gas chambers, and the ruins of the crematoria. They survived as evidence of these murders. The Majdanek camp was situated along the highway from Lublin to Zamość. The SS headquarters and the commandant's office were located adjacent to the road. The camp was surrounded by 18 guard towers, each of them 24 feet high, and manned by SS guards armed with machine guns. The gas chambers stood near the entrance to the main camp, next to the working barracks. The camps within the camps were separated from each other by double barbed wire fences. Each complex had a roll call area with a gallows where many executions took place as a means of intimidation. The crematorium, which was built in 1943, stood next to the execution ditches. On June 22, 1941, the German army invaded the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner by the Germans in the first months of the war. The German army shared responsibility for the misery and the catastrophic conditions suffered by the Russian prisoners of war as they tried to survive out in the open, sometimes in holes they dug in the ground itself. Heinrich Himmler received permission from the Army Command to put several 100,000 Soviet prisoners of war to work producing military equipment and clothing in factories belonging to the SS. Himmler, shown here at the prisoner of war camp in Minsk, visited Lublin on the 20th and 21st of July, 1941, and assigned SS Group Leader Globocnik to build a camp near Lublin for at first 50,000 prisoners of war and later up to 150,000. The high death rate among the prisoners of war prevented the transfer of so many captives, but the camp was still built as planned. The first 2,000 Soviet prisoners of war began work in November and December of 1941. Many died or were shot. In the following years, construction to expand the camp was continued by Polish and Soviet prisoners under inhumane conditions. Contagious diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis as well as the entirely insufficient nourishment and lack of water, led to a death rate that was without equal, even when compared with other concentration camps. Under the supervision of SS guards, the first Soviet prisoners to die of starvation were buried by their comrades. It was with this sound movie camera that the famous Soviet cameraman and director Roman Kaman and the Polish cameraman Adolf Forbet, together with their crew, shot the first film footage and interviews in the liberation camp in August 1944. The only survivors were 480 Soviet prisoners of war and 180 political prisoners who had remained in the camp as a last detail after its evacuation. Soviet prisoners of war retained their uniforms and were marked by the letters SU on their fronts and on their backs. The other prisoners had to wear striped prison uniforms carrying a colored stripe and a letter denoting their nationality. At Majdanek, the prisoners, both men and women, were marked with numbers up to 20,000. Due to the extremely high death rate, the numbers were issued many times. The many thousands who were selected to die never received a number. From March to the 19th of April, roughly 12,000 prisoners were deported in 12 contingents to other concentration camps, such as Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen. The last train load left Majdanek for Auschwitz on the 19th of July, 1944. General Kudryavtsev gives Lieutenant General Nikolai Alexandrovich Bulganin, member of the Defense Council and later Minister of War and Soviet Premier, a tour of the camp along with his staff. Bulganin is shown the gas chamber, the crematorium, the execution ditches, and barracks containing the victims' personal effects, including thousands of pairs of shoes. He speaks with the survivors. He then gives orders that all the men under his command are to visit the camp before going to the front, in order that they might see with their own eyes the scale and the horror of the extermination camp. He also gives the order to invite diplomats and Allied war correspondents to Majdanek from Moscow. By August 10th, Pravda's correspondents had already written about the crimes committed there. Bulganin suggests the setting up of an investigative commission to hear the testimony of survivors, SS guards, and eyewitnesses. Dr. Kudryavtsev is named deputy chairman of this commission. He outlines the commission's task in front of the camera on August 18, 1944.